First of all, I'm interested in how do you define the victory for Ukraine. In one of your latest interviews, speaking about your meetings with Ukrainian high officials, you mentioned, you underscored their expectations about the end of the war. You namely said that in the short-term perspective, they did not expect gaining back neither Crimea nor Donetsk and Luhansk. But this was before Bucha massacre. At the same time, it is known that if Russia tried to coach the whole territory of Donetsk and Luhansk, then it may try to conserve the conflict. What do you think, after devastating numbers of victims and ruins in Ukrainian cities, is ready Ukraine to agree with frozen conflict, or does it have to fight for the better perspective?
Well, that's a very hard question, and ultimately that's a question that Ukrainians should decide, not outsiders like myself. I think from my perspective as an analyst, watching this horrible, tragic war, if you think strategically, Putin has failed at most of his objectives. And I think that's important for people to remember before they start talking about Donbass. So if you remember, before he invaded, he talked about they're just Russians with accents. And his mission was to unite Ukrainians and Russians. Well, obviously, he's failed at that. That hasn't happened. Second, he said he was going to denazify Ukraine. And by that, he meant to overthrow the democratically elected government and to put in place his own puppet. And they even speculated about who might be the leader that Moscow would install in Kiev. That hasn't happened. Third, he talked about demilitarization of Ukraine. That obviously has not happened. Ukraine is way more militarized today than it was before the start of the war. Fourth, he tried to take Kiev and Kharkiv, the two largest cities in Ukraine. He failed to do that and had to withdraw. He had to retreat. And then don't forget about the other responses that are negative, in my view, to Russia. First and foremost, he kept claiming that he was trying to stop NATO expansion. And what he has done is unified NATO and expanded NATO. So NATO is much bigger today than it was before he invaded. And second, I think the economic costs of this war are going to be felt inside Russia for many, many years to come because of the sanctions. So on the broad scale, I think he's failed. But on the specifics of Donbass, of course, the Russian army is moving slowly. They're moving at a great cost to both Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers, but they haven't stopped. And I don't see any scenario under which Mr. Putin will stop until he's taken all of Donbass. And tragically, that's why I think this war will continue for a long time.
Leaders promised that they are ready to help Ukraine to defeat Russia until Ukraine needs it. This brings us to the question, does the time work for Ukraine? Because sooner or later, the Western societies start to feel fatigue of the war and its severe consequences. And at the same time, the Western governments tend to change through the election. We have already seen the results of the parliamentary election in France, where there are significant success of pro-Putin forces. So it means that Russia will try its best to give a helping hand to those Western forces who are loyal to them. And at the same time, we can't exclude that Russia will try to change the balance of power in the European Parliament in the upcoming elections in its favor. So, what should be done to stop Russia's ambitions, first of all, and does it seem realistic that fatigue of the war might overcome the support for Ukraine? And if so, when this breaking time come?
Again, that's a very difficult question, and I don't have a clear answer. But I would say two things. You're absolutely right about the long-term fatigue that you'll see in the West as the war goes on, not only in providing weapons, but also in providing financial assistance, because it's expensive right now. Ukraine is relying on the Western powers for financial support for their economy, $5 or $6 billion a month. And that will be hard to maintain, especially when we get into electoral cycles. And in my country, there's no doubt in my mind that there will be parliamentary candidates in the fall and presidential candidates as we get closer to 2024 who will say, why are we giving Ukrainians money? We have problems here at home. And if Mr. Trump becomes another candidate again, and there are lots of indications that he will, that's exactly the kind of argument that he will make. There's no doubt in my mind about it. But on the other side, I think there's fatigue on the Russian side as well. Don't forget that they don't have unlimited resources. They don't have unlimited soldiers and unlimited weapons. They're taking tremendous losses in this war right now. And the only reason they can continue to sustain it is because there is no independent media. There is no parliamentary elections there. There are no presidential elections there. If Russia were a democracy, I am sure that there would be a big debate inside that society about why are we fighting this war? Why are we giving up our boys to capture cities that most Russians don't even know where they exist? Russia's the largest country in the world. Why do they need more territory? That would be the kinds of arguments that you would have in a democratic society there. But fatigue is a problem there. But I think the policy solution to this issue is very clear. Do not extend the war. Try to do whatever you can to speed up the end of the war. And the way you do that from the outside, in my mind, is you provide the Ukrainians with more weapons, better weapons, at a faster pace. Because the only way the war will stop is if Putin's army is no longer marching. Right now, they're marching forward. They're marching west. They have to be stopped. And then second, more sanctions. There has not been, in my view, enough economic pressure on Putin and the Russian economy. There's lots more that could be done. And so more arms, more sanctions is the way to a faster peace. And that's the best way to avoid prolonging having to pay for this war by the outside Western powers.
So you have just mentioned about the upcoming midterm election and the presidential election in the U.S. Can we already speak about possible time frames of the end of the war in Ukraine, and can it coincide, for instance, with the start of the presidential election in the United States, as President Biden and the Democratic Party need a winner's cloud to succeed in the presidential race?
I hope so, because I want this war to end as soon as possible. But I don't think they're that interrelated. I think the dynamics on the battlefield are independent of electoral politics in the United States. Now, you're absolutely right to suggest that President Biden wants a win in this war in Ukraine as he goes into the elections. They want voters to think about the win in Ukraine and forget about the withdrawal in Afghanistan. That's without question. But I don't think that's the main motivation for what they're doing. And if you look at public opinion polling in America, inflation is the number one issue at 45%. Foreign policy is one of the lowest ranked issues. It's at 1%. The problem for Mr. Biden is that, and the Democratic Party, is that their opponents will blame inflation on sanctions on Russia. That's already happening. They're saying Biden is at fault for this inflation because of his response to the war and sanctions on oil and gas. Of course, that is absurdly oversimplistic. Sanctions are just one of many variables and not the most important variable causing inflation. But that argument will be made by their political opponents. So it's another argument for why they have their own electoral reasons. The Democratic Party in the parliamentary elections and the President Biden in the presidential election to end this war as soon as possible.
One question about President Trump. You have just mentioned about him. Does he has real chances to become again a presidential candidate?
He most certainly has real chances. Mr. Trump is very popular among a minority within the Republican Party, maybe a substantial minority. And because of our primary system, a very unique electoral system that we use in the United States, if there are several candidates running to win the nomination in the Republican Party, at each primary, if you can capture a substantial minority of the vote, you will eventually become the candidate. That's actually exactly what Mr. Trump did the last time, when there were many candidates, and he never won 50%. I don't even think he won 40% in most primaries, but he kept winning 25, 30%, and all the rest won less than that. And so I think he sees that as a strategy for winning the nomination, and I would not be surprised if he was the nominee again. That doesn't mean it'll be easy for him to win the presidency. I think it'll be difficult for him to defeat Mr. Biden or another Democratic candidate, but I do think it'll be relatively easy for him to win the nomination.
As I know, you are working very closely with Ukrainians on establishing the criteria for sanctions to be imposed on Russia and identifying the methods for avoiding sanctions. Do you consult the American government in developing the list of persons to be sanctioned? And are or will be among them Georgian names?
Well, the group that I coordinate is international and independent and nonpartisan. We have Americans, Ukrainians, Europeans, even a few Russians, by the way, that participate in this group. But we also do coordinate closely with the Ukrainian government, with the British government, with the American government, with EU officials, because we are trying to develop new ideas to help think about new things that can be done. So we consult with them, we talk with them. We don't take their advice. We're giving them advice. So with respect to names, we are the ones that generate those lists, and our working paper number 3 talks about how to expand the names of individual members for sanctions to make it thousands of people inside Russia. Our group has not yet talked about sanctioning people from other countries, but that is a topic of discussion that we are having soon. People from Georgia and people from Belarus in particular are in discussions, and I think there is a case to be made. I won't name names yet because we need to have an agreement, but I think there are most certainly individuals in your country and individuals in Belarus that are supporting Putin's war, and they therefore should suffer consequences as well.
The other day I was listening to a very interesting debate between you, Mr. Sikorsky, and the stars of realpolitik. You said that before the war in Ukraine, the West made its best to take into account Russia's fears and security interests and did not intend further enlargement of NATO. This was known to Russia as well as to Georgia and to Ukraine. How will the war in Ukraine influence on Georgia's NATO aspiration? Is Georgia's chances to enter the alliance racing or vice versa?
Well, I did say that, and I also said, I think in retrospect, that strategy was a mistake. And this goes back to Clinton. It started with President Clinton. trying to work with Russia while expanding NATO. President Bush did the same. President Obama did the same. Mr. Trump, I'm not really, it was kind of confusing what they were doing vis-a-vis NATO and Georgia and Ukraine. It's hard to even understand their policy. But there was always this idea of trying to expand NATO without and maintaining a relationship with Moscow. I think in retrospect, had we done the opposite and just expanded NATO as fast as possible without thinking about Russia, we might have had a better outcome. Because think about it, not a single NATO country has been attacked by Russia.
Of course.
But every country that has, including your country, Georgia and Ukraine, and the Moldovans still have the Russians on their borders, those are all countries that are not in NATO. So I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think in retrospect, had we responded more forcefully back in August 2008, with more sanctions and more weapons for Georgia, and then the same thing in 2014 in Ukraine, more weapons and more sanctions, maybe we would have avoided this tragic third war that's happening today. Those are just counterfactuals, right? We don't know for sure, but most certainly I think one has to consider that. But you asked about the future, not the past. I think it's too soon to know what will happen with respect to NATO. I think it was a historic achievement that the European Union made the decision to invite Ukraine and Moldova to join the European Union. I was saddened to see that Georgia was not on that list, but I'm still hopeful that in the long run, Georgia will be on that list. And I'm told by very senior EU officials that that is the plan. Once Georgia becomes qualified to be on the path towards joining the European Union. That's a fundamental change. We weren't talking about that just 4 or 5 months ago. And that makes me cautiously optimistic that Europeans have changed their views about your part of the world. And I'm more optimistic today than I was just a year ago about EU aspirations. And that, I think, has consequences for NATO as well. Not immediately, because I think many NATO countries will be nervous about that. But I think the fact that these countries are moving closer to the EU is good for NATO, and that NATO just expanded, is in the process of expanding again, and all the scary language out of the Kremlin, out of Moscow. If these countries join, if Finland and Sweden join, it'll be the end of the world. Turned out not to be true. And so I think that should give confidence to NATO leaders that sometimes doing the right thing can lead to more peaceful outcomes rather than leaving ambiguous security arrangements that lead to more conflictual outcomes.
And again about Georgia, I know Georgia very well, and it is obvious that today current Georgian government is blackmailed by Russia. That's why consequently it is distancing itself from the West. So what should Georgian government done to get free? What should Georgian government do to get free from Russian blackmail?
Well, I don't want to pretend that I know what's in Georgia's best interest and to guess and to make suggestions for governments and elected officials that live in a neighborhood that is a very difficult neighborhood where I don't live. And so it would be arrogant of me for an American to tell Georgians what to do. But I would say as an analyst and then as a historian, if you think about the long arc of history, those countries and those parts of the Russian Empire that remained within the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire and in the Russian sphere of influence have always performed more poorly than those that escaped the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire and Russian influence. It's just really that simple. Who's richer, who's poorer, Who has more freedom, who does not, who has more security, who does not. It's those that manage to liberate themselves from Soviet and Russian either occupation or annexation or influence. And I think in Putin's Russia, Russia also can change, by the way. And Russia in the 90s is not the same as Russia today. Mr. Putin is a different leader than Gorbachev or Yeltsin or even Medvedev, by the way, in my view. But Putin's Russia today is a very coercive place. It's a very corrupt place, and he uses force and invades countries without any respect to the individual human rights of the countries that he's invading. Just look at what's happening in Ukraine today. No respect at all for human rights, not even of his own soldiers, by the way. He doesn't care about his own soldiers, let alone Ukrainian soldiers, let alone Ukrainian citizens. So back thinking you're going to have a bright future by being allied with Mr. Putin, I think is a strategic mistake.
So what should Georgia demand from our Western partners to ensure our security?
Again, that's a very tough question because of the war in Ukraine. I think my perception of Washington, I can't speak for Brussels or other capitals in Europe, although I was just in Brussels last week in Washington, is that they are very focused on the war, as you would expect. And they believe, rightly in my view, that a victory for Ukraine in this war will have positive consequences for security throughout the region. And I think they're right about that. I think if Putin continues to take more territory in Ukraine, that will be bad for European security. That will be bad for Georgian security. And by the way, I think that'll be bad for security in Asia. I think it'll have negative consequences for the whole world. Conversely, if Putin can be stopped, that will be good for European security. That'll be good for Georgian security. That will be good for security of countries and territories threatened in Asia. And so I think they're right to try to focus on trying to help the Ukrainians stop Putin's army.
These days, there was an accident in the United States Embassy in Georgia when during the celebration party, acting members, acting MPs from the ruling party beat and insulted the founder and the director of one of the leading opposition TV. From your perspective, what should be the reaction of the United States Department of State? Because for me personally, this serves as a clear-cut example, evidence of disrespectful attitude from Georgia's ruling party to the United States.
Well, I just saw limited press reports about that, so I don't know the details. But I can say, as a former ambassador who used to host July 4th celebrations at my residence in Moscow, this is a sacred day for Americans. This is a very important day. I just hosted at my own house here in California 100 people to celebrate this day. And to tarnish that day by getting in a fight as a guest of the American government in Georgia is outrageous. And there's no excuse for it. And it saddens me. Frankly, lots of things sadden me in U.S.-Georgian relations right now, where it seems that there are certain forces in your country that don't value the relationship with my country, that have decided that it's not important to them. And I think that's a strategic mistake. But just on a human level, if you are a guest in somebody else's house, there's a certain decorum, even if it's not the 4th of July and even if it's not the Americans. And I think those people have embarrassed your country, frankly. It's shameful. And it's not just about them. It's about your country. They are embarrassing your country on the global stage.
Thank you. And the final question about Georgia's future role in the new European security architecture. If Russia is so weakened in the war with Ukraine and through sanctions that it can no longer serve as a factor of containing China in this part of the world, would it be appropriate if the West considers Georgia-Turkey axis together, Caspian and Central Asia countries, as an alternative that will be able to deter China in this region?
It's a very complicated, hard question because I think the Biden administration is rightly trying to do things to contain Chinese influence, but not overdo it because they don't want to create a new Cold War. And I agree that that's the right strategy. But what that means for me, I'm writing about China right now, is that we have to be much more engaged in winning over friends around the world, including in the Caucasus, including in Central Asia, because China's doing so. And I think we've been somewhat absent, frankly. We have not been engaged in those parts of the world, the rest of what's called the global south. And I think we have a better system of government. I think we have better opportunities for trade and investment, including infrastructure. I think we have better opportunities for military cooperation for countries like Georgia and others that you mentioned. And therefore, we need to be more engaged in offering an alternative to working with the Chinese. So I would support the idea of us being much more engaged in Georgia, with Turkey, and in Central Asia, because I think we have more to offer.
Thank you. This was really one of the most interesting interviews I have ever had. Thank you for your time.
Great. All right, thanks for doing it.
And I hope to see you in Georgia.